There are stars in the southern sky, southward as you go. There is moonlight and moss in the trees down the 7 Bridges Road. Oh, hello. Sorry about that. I didn't realize the camera was on. You kind of caught me off guard. This is supposed to be about the first few items on the Unit 6 study guide, item 1A through 1E. So that's what we're going to cover today. 1A of the study guide asks you to define judicial review and to describe the significance of the Supreme Court's decision in Marbury v. Madison. Judicial review is something we've been talking about all year long. Should be pretty simple at this point. It is the power of the courts to declare the acts of the other branches, laws passed by Congress, and acts of the President to be unconstitutional. As for the Marbury v. Madison case, this should also be reviewed for everybody. As we learned a long time ago, the significance of the case is that it was the first time the Supreme Court claimed to have the power of judicial review and actually used it and got away with it. A hugely important case in our history because if you listen to the first video or watch the first video, the phrase judicial review, the exact words, shall have power to declare laws unconstitutional, do not appear in Article 3 of the Constitution. It was not clear to everybody in America at the time that the Supreme Court should have such a power. John Marshall, the head of the court at the time, was a Federalist and believed in the power of the federal government and believed in the powerful third branch of government. And when he decided the Marbury case, he went to great pains to explain that, of course, courts need to have this power to defend the Constitution from the other branches. Without this case, the Supreme Court would be, and the court system in general, would be very weak compared to the other branches. The significance of the case is that because of the decision in Marbury v. Madison, we have a truly powerful, co-equal third branch of government. Item 1B of the study guide asks you to describe the significance of the good behavior clause of Article 3 of the Constitution. If you listened or watched the other video and you read Article 3 of the Constitution, I emphasized how enormously important the good behavior clause is because it creates a truly independent, of the other two branches, an independent judicial branch. The other branches have to worry about re-election to keep their power. Once a judge is nominated and confirmed, they serve during good behavior, which essentially means for life. All they have to do is show up and do their job. Congress can impeach them, but this is done so rarely that it's not really even a factor. Members of the Supreme Court, other judges, members of the federal judicial branch don't have to be constantly looking over their shoulder at the other branches. They can't lose their jobs just because they decide a case incorrectly. They are independent of the other two branches, and the main reason it is because of the good behavior clause of Article 3 of the Constitution. Item 1C of the study guide asks you to describe all the checks and balances between the judicial and other branches. You should be very familiar with the charts that I've given you or that are in your book describing the entire system of checks and balances. Here we're mainly discussing the powers of the other two branches against the judicial branch and the power of the judicial branch versus the other branches. A quick summary would be this: the main control that the other branches have over the judicial branch is by controlling who becomes a judge in the first place. The president nominates judges, the Senate confirms them or not, and that controls who is actually in the judicial branch at all. Once they're there, of course, as we just discussed, they serve for life or literally during good behavior. And there's not a whole lot that the other two branches can do to them, although we will come back to some things that they can do in a few slides. And of course, the main power of the judicial branch versus the other branches is the power of judicial review. As you'll see in a moment, Congress has other options that we'll explore. The president can also pardon federal criminals if he disagrees with how a federal law is applied by the federal courts. But for the most part, the judicial branch is pretty secure in its power. Item 1D of the study guide asks you to describe the significance of the court's refusal to give advice to the president regarding the legality of his actions. Early in our history, I believe it was President Washington was contemplating doing something, and he wrote a letter to the Supreme Court asking if what he was about to do would be constitutional, and they wrote back very politely that that is not something they do. They don't give advice on something before it's happened. The Article 3 of the Constitution says that the judicial power shall extend only to cases, actual disputes under actual laws that come before the courts. They did not see it as within their power to simply give advice to other branches, which is interesting because if they had done so, that would have increased their power, because if the Supreme Court could do this, let's say Congress is debating a bill and wants to know if they pass it, would it be constitutional? If this is the way the system worked, if they could just send it over to the Supreme Court and say, hey, would this be unconstitutional? That would give the Supreme Court a lot more power than it has, because they could sort of intervene before things happen, before the other branches take action, and stop them just by giving advice. But this is not what the Supreme Court does. They have to wait till the law is passed, and then it gets enforced, and someone's in the court system disputing the law. Then they can act and evaluate whether a law is constitutional or not. They would have more power if they could give legal advice to the other branches, but they don't see their power as going that far. And the last thing we'll discuss in this video is item 1E. Describe the steps Congress can take if a law is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. There are a variety of steps. They take time, and a lot of them aren't likely to happen. But the most likely thing a Congress is to do, if one of their laws is declared unconstitutional, is simply to repass the law with different wording, because typically what the Supreme Court will find unconstitutional about a law, in their decision they will specify exactly what in the law was the problem. And what Congress will frequently do is pass the same law again, just changing the wording to maybe address what the Supreme Court said was wrong. Usually that fixes the problem. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But that's the most likely thing that Congress will do. In rare cases, Congress may actually propose an amendment to the Constitution to change the Constitution so that the law that they want to pass would be constitutional. This has only worked in a very small number of situations. We'll talk about that later. But it is an option that Congress has. It can alter the number of judges on the Supreme Court. This is more in theory, because Congress can set the number at 9 or make it lower or make it higher. Let's say if the Supreme Court makes an unpopular decision, Congress could, in theory, say, hey, Mr. President, go ahead and nominate some more judges, and then we'll confirm them, and then there'd be more judges on the court that we like that would decide these kind of cases differently. That could all happen in theory, but it's never really happened in fact. There was an episode back in the 1930s when President Roosevelt was fearful of the Supreme Court striking down more and more of his New Deal laws, so he proposed that Congress should allow him to appoint several more justices, of course justices that would agree with his programs. That proposal to give Roosevelt that ability just never went anywhere. It was very controversial at the time, and it's a famous example of basically the two branches realizing that they're not supposed to monkey with the judicial branch like that. Another possibility is to create other courts or change the jurisdiction of the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That is also done very rarely. And of course, Supreme Court justices and any federal judge can be impeached. But like we said in an earlier slide, that is highly unlikely to happen. Well, that's all the time I have today. That's all Mr. Morse wanted me to talk about. So I guess he's going to put me back in my box. It's been such a beautiful day outside.